You are here with Tri-Pedal Reviews. This video is going to be a monologue going over the differences between generation loss versions. If you want to hear a comparison of the models I have sound-wise, check out Round 2, Part 2 of the Lofi Shootout. I'll link that video in the description. That video is heavily time-stamped and you should be able to jump around to any pedal you are interested in. That video will also give you an idea of alternative pedals to the generation loss that can get similar sounds. There are currently a total of 5 versions of the gen loss. I'll be going over those differences and pointing out what I consider to be the pros and cons of each. Hopefully this will give you a better idea of which one to go for if you plan on purchasing one. Prices have become astronomical due to the limited availability in pedal flippers, so having as much information before selling or going into a purchase is a good thing. The initial intent of the pedal was to be the best representation of a degraded VHS or tape sound. CooperFX has improved upon this idea over time, which we can clearly see in the history of this pedal. First, let's take a look at the basic building blocks of a generation loss. Sample rate reduction, high pass and low pass filtering, random vibrato, which is the slower speed fluctuations, flutter, which is the higher speed and typically higher pitch fluctuations, a section for added noise, and various ways of mixing the wet and dry signal. The combination of these things make up a generation loss. The first iteration of the generation loss had speed and depth control over the random vibrato function. Starting out, the gen loss didn't have any flutter controls, so for Tom, the creator of this pedal, the first iteration was less than ideal for the sound he was going for. The giant knob unlabeled in the middle of the pedal was the mix control. This differs from future iterations that did away with the mix control in favor of wet and dry levels. There were 2 primary complaints on this version of the pedal. One was the noise was just static white noise. The second was with certain filter settings. There could be a drastic volume drop as there was no volume control to make up for lost frequencies. Since you could apply both high and low pass filtering at the same time, the probability of losing volume was quite high. The second iteration of this pedal was the gen loss with noise mod. This was in essence the same pedal as the first iteration, but with a modification to the noise section of the pedal. The noise mod was really the beginning of the flutter sound, just applied to the noise and not necessarily the primary wet signal. To me, the best iteration of the generation loss is this pedal. The reason for this, I personally am not a big fan of garbled tape sounds. I gravitate towards vinyl style modulation, which has less sharp and slower pitched fluctuations. And I'm also not particularly fond of static white noise. I vastly prefer just having a wet-dry mix rather than a wet-dry level, for the simple fact that it's very easy to work with. With lo-fi pedals, I typically like to keep things a bit subtle, and the beginning of the flutter sound that was implemented with the noise mod in this pedal was perfect. Since I'm personally after a more vinyl-type modulation, I very much need control of the speed and depth of the random vibrato, which was lost in future iterations. The primary con on this pedal, though, is still the volume drop, which was not addressed. Chase Bliss teamed up with CooperFX to release a gen loss in the Chase Bliss pedal format. When I first heard this, I was very excited as I love Chase Bliss and I love CooperFX, and eventually Tom actually went to work for Chase Bliss. When the Chase Bliss gen loss came out, I immediately sold my version 1 gen loss and picked up a Chase Bliss version without a second thought. Surely the Chase Bliss version had to be better with more control, right? Well, not exactly. Kinda not. We'll start with the pros. The primary issue of volume loss was solved by giving us a wet level control. That is a great addition to this pedal and future iterations of this pedal. This was the first iteration in which we got all sorts of control options such as MIDI, expression, CV, ramping, and auxiliary functions. Just to mention them, the aux functions you had control over were mod, which allowed you to max the modulation wow and flutter at the press of a button. Gen, which allowed you to switch your sample rate reduction maximum to a user-defined knob position, or filter, which allowed you to bypass the filtering with a click of a switch. Note that aux functions in this pedal differ from the V2, which we will talk about later. Also, the Chase Bliss version kept the dynamic noise of the noise mod in previous versions. Now for the cons. You lost control over the vibrato's speed and depth. Instead, these 2 functions were tied to one knob, which means you can't adjust both individually. You have to be okay with whatever they dialed in. Second, you lost control of your mix on a knob. Instead, the Chase Bliss version allows you 3 mix levels of your dry signal via a switch: none, half, and unity. This was a big deal to me as I could never get the mix where I wanted it. Having this on a knob would have easily solved that. While they included dynamic noise on this version, the downside is they didn't do it on a knob either, but again on a selection switch with 3 options. This again meant that you had to be content with whatever they dialed in rather than being able to dial it in precisely yourself. Lastly, this is the first iteration to officially implement flutter. The flutter on this pedal is harsh, to say the least. While this may have been closer to Tom's original vision, it didn't do anything for me personally, and I'll remind you my personal tastes are more geared towards vinyl style modulation and not tape style modulation. My frustration with the Chase Bliss generation loss was that I just didn't have enough control to make it sound as good as the version 1 sounded. Most everything I tried to dial in was way too over the top, way too dirty, just too much in general. Those that are searching for the mangled tape sound, I'm sure you'd be much happier with this pedal than I was. Out of all the iterations, I'd say it's my least favorite, which is funny because it commands the highest price online. There is a great video online comparing the Chase Bliss version to a Genloss V2. I'll link that in the description, but pay attention to the harshness of the flutter on the Chase Bliss version. Next came the arcades. The arcades was a concept where you pretty much bought a pedal that was a blank slate and then purchased cards that contained effects you would be interested in. One of those cards was a Genloss card. On the surface, this looks fantastic given it's digitally controlled and can have multiple screens of parameters. But to really understand why it may or may not be great for you, you need to look a bit further. So for the pros, we finally get both a wet and dry level control tied to knobs. We also get control of the clock, in which we can change the operating speed of the DSP. This opens up a lot more possibilities for lo-fi, noisier sounds. A side note, I love any pedal that gives control of the clock. It's a win in my book. You still have MIDI and expression control as well as an assignable aux switch. With the Genloss card, you get access to previous iterations of the Genloss. For example, one algorithm gives you control of speed and depth of the vibrato like on version 1. One algorithm gives you access to something more along the lines of the Chase Bliss version. Some give you dynamic noise, some static. So in that sense, it's great. The cons of the pedal. None of the algorithms give you control of all parameters of a Genloss at once. For me, the beauty of the Genloss is the sum of its parts and not necessarily just portions of them. For instance, on one algorithm you may get fine control of wow and flutter, but no gen control or filtering. One algorithm you might get filtering, but with reduced control over wow and flutter. So at face value it seems better, but you dig in a little and you realize it's not really the same thing. This isn't a one-to-one comparison of other Genlosses. Another thing I do not like on the arcades is the tone control was implemented in the global section. This has an effect on your tone, and no amount of dialing I've been able to do keeps the tone unaffected as much as I'd like. The tone is always altered, and I'm not a big fan of that. This is separate from the filtering you can do. I found that knob positions seem unsmooth and digitized. What I mean by that is when you go to fine-tune parameters, the turning isn't smooth. Occasionally you'll get values jumping even after you've let go of the knob, indicating there is some type of stepping going on internally. Lastly, I found knob to screen mapping as a bit confusing, as parameters are lined up left to right, but knobs are lined up left to right in 2 rows. So occasionally you adjust one you didn't mean to adjust. Genloss is but one of the cards for the arcades, and the pedal is capable of a lot more. I go in depth into each algorithm of the Genloss card in part 2 of the Lofi Shootout. So if you want to hear all of that, check that video out. Again, the link is in the description. 5 iterations of the Genloss later, we finally get to the version 2. Both wet and dry levels were kept on knobs, albeit small ones. This version gave us a bit less harsh flutter than the Chase Bliss version. It gave us both static noise and the noise mod version of noise, triggered by turning the noise knob either left and right of noon. All the great control options are here, like MIDI expression and aux functions. The aux functions here are tape stop, tape garble, and spectral freeze or drone. For the cons, one I didn't think would make a lot of difference but does to me after using the pedal, small knobs. The knobs included on the second row of this pedal are mini knobs, which are not nearly as easy to adjust as the bigger knobs. For wet, dry, and noise, this is not a big deal, but for the gen control it is to me. Gen is a control I like to fine-tune, and I find it significantly harder to do on the version 2 with mini knobs. In addition, and it may just be my particular pedal, but I'll mention it anyways, sometimes when I'm attempting to adjust the gen knob, it will have little to no effect or a reduced range of effect. Then the next time you go to adjust it, it works as expected. Again, I don't know if that's an issue with all V2s or just mine, but I've noticed it, so I'm pointing it out. The only other complaint I have on this version is a lack of vibrato control. No individual control for speed and depth, but just the combination with wow. Overall, the flutter and general sounds of the pedal are less harsh than the chaseless version, so I hope this information was helpful and gives you more information to go off before making a purchase. I'll again reiterate, the generation loss is by no means the only pedal that does these types of sounds. There are a ton of pedals that get similar sounds, so you don't need to sell your firstborn to acquire one. The Lofi Shootouts I've done and other Lo-Fi videos I've done should give you some ideas. For me, the best gen loss is the version 1 with noise mod, because I personally am not looking for garbled tape sounds, and that one, aside from the volume drop issue, had the best sounds to my ears, and could be dialed the most subtle. I understand garbled tape is the entire point of this pedal, but that type of stuff just is not my preference. I'd like to see normal sized knobs and individual depth and speed controls for the vibrato make a comeback in future iterations. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and stay tuned for more pedal reviews in the future. Hope you have a great day. Thanks. Bye.